I have always been incredibly entranced by the wilderness. Growing up in Bailey, Colorado, up in the mountains, I've always been surrounded by the forest. A wilderness full of trees, dirt, rocks, twigs, and imagination. That was my playground, not the swings. I fell in love with the outdoors. Anytime you'd look for me, I would be outside. It was where I went to when I was bored, where I did my schoolwork, because I was homeschooled, so that was good, and where I could truly be myself. The wilderness was my sanctuary. I would wake up early in the morning and, I would wake up early in the morning and watch as the mist was over the trees. I would watch the sun as it descended behind the mountain skyline. I would gaze upon the stars as they twinkled up in the sky and replaced the clouds. I was truly outside almost all of the time. I spent my entirety of my life outside. It was where I went to for comfort if I was ever feeling upset, and it was where I would go to when everything else in the world seemed to be falling apart. It was my sanctuary, my home. I leapt at every opportunity I could take to spend time outside. So I worked my past 3 summers at a Christian camp called Idra Haji. This camp really showed me the wonders and the gloriousness of outside through adventure activities and rock climbing and working with kids. It's truly a magnificent world. Additionally, I was able to view fragments of unhindered love and beauty in little kids. Because of this, and because of my love for ministering to kids, I'd centered my entire capstone around ministry through outdoor adventure. I love the outdoors with every fiber of my being, and when I'm stressed, going outside is the thing that rejuvenates me. There's something beautiful about it, something inherently good about the outdoors. This is evident all throughout the Bible, as a significant portion of Jesus' ministry occurs in the outdoors, not inside. Jesus constantly departed from the crowds and synagogues and wandered into the wilderness for quiet meditation. The wilderness was where God constantly revealed himself. The wilderness truly was a wonderful solitude, a place of nourishment, of rejuvenation. It was a captivating place where you could find peace, transformity, and imaginative wonder. But, in true paradoxical form, as I would soon come to realize through the course of my senior year, the wilderness is also a place of danger, temptation, chaos. The Hebrew word for wilderness is the same word used to describe a desert, midbar. Midbar is used to describe a wandering or getting lost in the desert. In this context, the wilderness is also a place of fear, of danger. The wilderness is a place of thirst and starvation. The wilderness is truly a perplexing mystery because it embodies both chaos and harmony. It has an ever-present danger that is constantly there, as well as a settling peace. The wilderness it offers temptation, but it also offers transformity. The wilderness truly is a magnificent juxtaposition. It is wild, untamable, and absolutely beautiful. And I wanted to discern why it was so good. I wanted to discern how it could make the world a better place. I began my journey with a clear goal in mind. But funny enough, in those journeys, you will at one point find yourself straying from the path slightly and finding an incredible adventure. I had a certain idea exactly what my capstone adventure would look like, but the turns I took were drastically different than anything I would have expected. And I wound up getting a little bit lost in the wilderness, figuratively, and in my mind. And my journey about ministry through outdoor adventure would encounter many ambiguous twists and numerous bumps along the way, just as great adventures often do. My journey started with the solo. The solo was where all of us seniors had to spend a significant amount of time alone in the woods. Now, we were supposed to contemplate tough questions and discern what it was we truly wanted. Now, it has always been a tough question for me since I struggled discerning what I want at a Starbucks, let alone what I want in life. So as we began our time in the woods, I began to feel an overwhelming and indescribable feeling of loneliness. Growing up, I've always been surrounded by people. I have 11 siblings, so lots of people, and I'm an extreme extrovert. I surround myself with people every second of my day. But I began to feel loneliness sitting there in the woods, and the feeling, it was simultaneously calming and relaxing all at once. It was incredibly calming to be sitting alone in the wilderness, just listening to the breeze rustle the trees and see the leaves fall, listen to the birds and see the ants crawling on my leg. But it was also terrifying at the same time because I was completely alone with my thoughts as my only companion. As I sat there in the wilderness, writing in my journal, I began to see the small imperfections of the world. I was sitting in the outdoors, in the one place where I had always found sanctuary, the one place I could really call home. And yet, things seemed damaged somehow. but at the same time they were also complete and whole. I began to see a paradox that I would begin to see further throughout the entire senior year. The world was full of beauty, but it was also full of tragedy. There was a mixture of perfection and terror, and it was difficult to describe because it was simultaneously all perfection, all terror. It wasn't one of either. The sun was shining, and it was radiant, and it was beautiful, but at the same time, I also felt like I was in a hole that had a never-ending descent. It was cold, but not because of the wind, because it just felt cold. It was at this point in my journey that I began to realize that I had been looking at the world through a broken lens. I wore a set of prescription glasses. I don't actually wear glasses. I wore a set of prescription glasses that had helped me ignore the very existence of malice and evil. I had seen the world as only sunshine, only happy. I had envisioned it as perfection, as a constantly moving masterpiece that didn't even need an audience to flourish. But as I sat there underneath the beautiful shaded tree, listening to the wind rustle it and hearing the various animals scatter about, I began to see something different, something that my optimistic side had always refused to even believe existed. I began to see that the world was a little bit dirty. Not in the sense that there was dirt everywhere, because I was in the woods, but in the sense that it was dirty. I sat underneath my little tree, and I thought about tragedies. I thought about abandoned children, and abortions, and suicides. I thought about murders, and the crimes people commit against each other. I thought about people who died because of cancer or sickness. And I thought about mass shootings. The sadness and emptiness people feel. The loneliness that drives someone to drink their sorrow away past the point of intoxication, or that causes people to get high on drugs or cut their wrists out of self-hatred. I thought about death, about how no one can prevent it, only try to avoid it for as long as possible, to no avail. And I thought about an ever-present darkness that seemed to be constant, even in the moments of brilliant light. However, as I continued to think about it, the world wasn't all darkness and tragedy either. It was beautiful. Children laughed, flowers bloomed, and there was joy and love all throughout the world. It wasn't all darkness, and it wasn't all beauty. There was mysterious light in the wilderness, and I really wanted to discern what that was. I didn't understand why the wilderness embodied such a hope. Despite the amount of accumulating ambiguity and atrocity, there was an equal amount of hope, and I wanted to discern why that was. I wanted to discern how there could be a balance of both hope and darkness, light and darkness. The world was broken, and I realized that I couldn't fix it, so I wanted to discern why. And it was this point, gazing at the atrocity and the disposition of the world, that I began to ask the question, why? Why was the world so broken? And why were people so atrocious to one another? Why was there an ever-accumulating darkness that seemed to be ever-present in the world, even in the face of brilliant light? These questions, and one similar to these, began to flood my head. If God was perfect, why was there such an imperfect world? And how are we supposed to thrive in a world that is so destructive? Where was God in all of this mess? After a while, sitting there underneath my tree, I grew fed up with my complacency, and I began to pace through the forest, walk around, and make observations. The sun glistened elegantly on the damp leaves and sent radiant sparks of light in every direction. The forest was beautiful, and I could hear the birds chirping and hear their melodious lullabies. It was simply beautiful. It was the epitome of gorgeousness. It was beautiful, but it was also dirty. There was also so much sadness, so much darkness in the world, and that I couldn't ignore anymore. I then chose to stop contemplating my questions and start asking them. I began to ask God the questions I was contemplating. To any observer, I would have looked like a mental patient as I paced aimlessly throughout the forest, asking question after question, making observations, talking to God. But after a long time of this, I began to feel more like I was talking to myself than to God. He was somewhere far off. I still believed that he existed. I just didn't believe that he was talking to me at that current present moment. I was lost in a sea of questions, looking for a lighthouse of hope from God, but none came. At least not in the way I expected it to come. The solo ended, and as it did, I was frustrated because none of my questions were answered, and I was only filled with more ambiguity and vagueness. I didn't understand the world, and I didn't understand the confusion of my paradox. I didn't understand God either. He seemed to have the missing piece to the puzzle of this world, and yet he refused to place it. He could easily fix the puzzle of life, yet he chose not to. I began to get a little lost in my head, not in the wilderness, don't worry, as I kept contemplating over things. There was so much hurt in the world, but there was also so much joy. I worked with little kids who felt lost and alone, like nobody on earth loved them. But then I worked with the same kids who sparked joy and excitement over the simplest of things, who got excited over SpongeBob SquarePants. There was so much joy, so much laughter, but also so much tragedy and darkness. Good friends of mine committed suicide because that seemed like the only way to escape pain. Hunger and death. I didn't understand how it all worked. I lost faith. Not in the sense that I completely doubted God's existence in general, but in the sense that I knew he existed and I just couldn't comprehend why the world was the way it was. I didn't understand the perplexity of life. I didn't understand the paradox. And I didn't understand God. As the year progressed, I continued to search for answers wherever I could find them. The only trouble was I only found more ambiguity and vagueness. As a class, we read through the book of Ecclesiastes, and I found a verse that said, "What is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted." But the struggle I found with this verse was, if there's no way to fix it, then why are we even here? If what is crooked cannot be straightened, what is our point on this earth? And what is our point pacing through and trying to fix the world if it's not going to get any better? And I kept contemplating. I kept getting filled with questions. Question after question after question. It all accumulated into a mass that was my doubt. I decided that my next course of action would be to ask those questions. I'm sure I probably annoyed many of my teachers as I came up with constant, deep questions that I needed to discern the answers to. And we were also given the opportunity to interview 2 other people, which I additionally plagued with my incessant questions, my deep questions, the questions I needed to know the answers to move forward. But the more questions I asked, the more questions I found. And with every answer I got, there came along like 3 more questions that I needed to find answers to. It was almost like what started as a simple string of questions quickly accumulated into a gigantic spiderweb that seemed to entangle what I believed and balance it in a very precarious way. In many ways, this has both excited me and terrified me at the same time, because on the one hand, there were sometimes no answers to the deep questions I needed to know, no instant gratification to my pondering. However, on the other hand, there was an endless assortment of questions I could ask, questions to contemplate, questions to struggle through, a purpose to life. So I quickly determined that I absolutely love asking questions. I love the journey. I love the thrill of struggling through things and asking millions and millions of questions, even if it annoys my teachers and friends. And I also learned that it was okay to not know all the answers, because we never will know all the answers. I learned that it was okay just to ask questions, and ask question after question after question, and struggle for the answers together. But the world was still a paradox. There was still a certain beauty in everything, yet there was also pain and chaos. The world was full of perfection, yet was also an incomplete puzzle that was missing pieces. It was glasses that were full but also needed to be filled. It was tears that were dripping down, but at the same time they didn't need to be dried. Lost yearning to be found, but they were already found. It was a very complex paradox. I truly began to see something that I really had chosen to ignore before, my entire life. The world really is dirty. Being an optimist, I always saw the bright side of the world. I always saw the rainbow that emerged after a storm, or the butterfly that comes out after the cocoon. I'd never focused on the darkness. And I wouldn't say I was necessarily ignorant of the world. I wouldn't say that I didn't know about the darkness and I didn't know it existed. I certainly knew it existed. I just chose to ignore it. But I chose to only look for the sunshine. I wholeheartedly thought that the world was all black and white, that it was clearly defined, that it was either all perfect or all imperfect. It was either all good or all bad. But through this senior year, I've learned that the world doesn't work the way I thought it did. It isn't clearly defined in certain little boxes that is organized. It's much more chaotic, similar to the wilderness. I always viewed the cup as half full or overflowing, and the world full of abundance. And that's not necessarily wrong, because it is half full, and it is full of abundance. But even in this year alone, there have been so many school shootings that I find myself at a loss to separate one from another. But yet there is also the presence of a constant, beautiful creation. Trees and beautiful forests, rocks to climb, rappel down. There's an adventure outside. But at the same time, there's also natural disasters that spur without warning and kill hundreds of thousands of people. I look at the world and I see love, but I also see hatred. I witness good friends of mine fall apart because of a tragedy. But then I witness that same tragedy cause a community to bond together. Life is absolutely incredible, but it ends abruptly. Years are long, yet time is short. The world is a mixture of perpetual radiancy embedded with spots of gray. The world is absolutely beautiful and stunning. Love is everywhere and self-sacrifice is evident everywhere. But there's still so much pain. I aspired to look for the hope, to find a meaning amidst all of the dirt, an answer to my paradox. I wanted to discern why there was a constant state of both light and darkness. As I trekked through my senior year, I continued to investigate the wilderness and discern why it embodied such sparks of hope for me, while simultaneously engulfing that spark. While I was doing this, I was kind of running away from God in a sense. I was so angry and frustrated. I didn't understand why the world was so evil. It was so bad. I didn't understand why there was so much dirt embedded into everything. And I didn't understand God. And so I chose the best course of action, which was to just simply ignore God. Ignore it and the problem goes away. Bad advice. I didn't understand. So I refused to close my eyes during prayers because I refused to pray directly to God. I refused to sing when it was worship time because I didn't want to sing to God. I didn't do this because I was necessarily angry at God, although I was. I did this because I was frustrated. I was lost in my own confusion, and I blamed God for that. I was so confused. However, I quickly realized that this was an impossibility, because God was absolutely everywhere at once, but at the same time, he was also nowhere. Another paradox. Every conversation I had resulted in the mention of God, yet I never had a direct interaction with God, however I would define that. As I learned more about the outdoor environment, I continued to ask the question, why did it embody such hope for me? Why was it so hopeful? I didn't know. In class, Mr. Spector and Mr. Butler kept forcing us to determine what was so good about what we loved. Through this, I found that I simply couldn't explain why the wilderness was good without mentioning God. And it didn't really stop there. I began to see that the only good thing in this dirty world was God, or directly associated with God. And God was good. It was kind of ironic because this entire year I was running away from God and running towards what I believed was good. But I now realize that substantive goodness is merely a synonym for God. They are one and the same. Running away from God and running towards something good is, in a sense, running away from the same thing I'm running away from. Doesn't make any sense, and it's another paradox. Through senior year, I got to read a book called Renewal in the Wilderness. This book truly embodied what I had been struggling with. It mentioned that God was really the only true and ardent arrow that was pointed towards all of the hope. All of the hope was only accredited to God. But I was still stuck in my paradox because I was very stubborn and I refused to leave that paradox. Because God seemed, and all the arrows seemed to point directly at God as the hope for any and all everything. However, he was also the one who refused to grant that hope upon the broken world. I continued to contemplate in circular motion. God was good, and I found this, but the world was broken. God was the solution, yet the world was still broken. Yet God was also the only one who could fix this. I couldn't fix it, and that was frustrating. I quickly found that it didn't matter what I was pursuing. If I truly was seeking after what was good, then there was no physical way I could avoid God. I realized that my entire year I'd kind of been like Jonah, running away from Nineveh in search of Tarshish, and I was stuck inside a rhetorical whale, too stubborn to see that running away from God was an impossibility. I was having an internal battle with myself, and it was frustrating. As I continued to ask questions and seek answers, I determined that the world really can't be fixed, and I still don't understand why, but I can continue to seek answers and ask questions. So now, as senior year comes to a close, and I step out into a dirty world that is full of ambiguity and darkness, I know that there's pain and sorrow, but there is also beauty. And yes, the world is truly dirty, and there's nothing I can do to change that. But I can't wait to get lost in the wilderness and search for what is truly good.